Complaints about how much charging merchants, your cut going down, makes me wonder like how the heck you're going to make this a business with all this competition that is profitable and sustainable.
Food delivery apps like Uber Eats or DoorDash are some of the worst businesses I've ever seen. And I don't just mean bad from an investor perspective. These apps have somehow managed to rake in tens of billions of dollars of bookings while providing terrible service for customers, insane fees for restaurants, bottom of the barrel pay for drivers, and negative returns for shareholders. And it's all about to get a whole lot worse. Exploring the economics of these apps has been one of the most fascinating yet confusing experiences for me, because despite these businesses charging huge and increasing fees to customers and restaurants, as well as offering pretty terrible pay for their drivers, none of these apps still make any money. Even Uber, which handles as much gross bookings as McDonald's does in restaurant sales across 38,000 stores, lost $4.6 billion last year. So today, I'm going to be breaking down the economics of these food delivery services. I'm going to talk about why Uber nor any other app that it competes against has a networking effect, despite many investors suggesting that Uber does have one. And I want to talk about why these apps are going to get a lot worse before they get better. I also can't help but notice that 52% of you are not subscribed. That's obviously incredibly selfish. I spent like 10 hours making this video and you can't just sit up straight, reach for the mouse and click a little red button. Shame on you. But as for the 48% who are subscribed, welcome back. Can I get you anything? A drink? A snack? Just the video? Okay, we'll get straight into the video. So stupid. The really strange thing about this type of business, food delivery, is that every single stakeholder, every type of person that's involved in the process is losing. Let's start from the restaurant perspective. Firstly, Uber and these other apps charge restaurants huge fees to be listed on their apps. For Uber Eats, restaurants have to pay $500 upfront for account setup and photography, and then Uber takes a 30% cut from all item prices, as well as still taking 16% even if it's delivered through restaurant staff, and 6% even if it's picked up. And this 30% fee is not something that's unique to Uber. This is pretty much a standard fee across many of the major apps, including DoorDash, which also charges 30% and even charges 15% for pickup. And the ways that restaurants are screwed over by these apps doesn't end there. Most of these apps have extremely liberal refund policies, and if the refund is in regards to something in terms of food quality or missing items, then that's going back to the restaurant, and the restaurant still has to pay that huge fee on the gross order value. So if you think about this from the perspective of a $100 order, Uber Eats is taking $30, and then if that order happens to be refunded, then the restaurant's actually out $130. They will be losing more than the total sales amount of the food in the first place. And it really doesn't get better from there. We can talk about drivers. Well, I guess when it comes to drivers, it kind of depends on your perspective. On one hand, in certain regions, drivers will have the opportunity to make quite a bit more than the minimum wage, which is certainly a positive thing. If you take Australia, for example, drivers on average make about 20 to 30 Australian dollars per hour, of course, depending on how many deliveries they do during that time. And that is quite a bit higher than the $21 minimum wage that we have. Workers also get the flexibility to work as much or as little as they want, and they can clock in and clock out pretty much whenever they want, and the amount that they'll be earning for each delivery will be impacted by the demand at that particular moment relative to how many delivery people there are around. But that's also a double-edged sword, because demand is one of the factors involved in how much they're making. It also means the pay is very, very inconsistent and can fluctuate even on similar times and similar days. How much you make during the hours that you put in could vary massively. On top of that, in most places, Uber drivers or delivery drivers for these apps will be considered independent contractors, meaning they don't have the same benefits as someone who would be a casual or a part-time employee, things like sick leave, annual leave, or maybe superannuation if you're in Australia. And this is actually a really highly debated topic, or has been over the past couple of years, and there's been many places, states or countries even, that have switched and converted these drivers from being independent contractors or classified as independent contractors to being classified as employees, so that they can get more benefits. In 2019, California actually passed a law to reclassify gig workers as employees, and as a result, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and PostMates all joined together to come up with the Prop 22 ballot. This was essentially a proposed law that would go against this shift from independent contractors to employees, and the hopes was that they would get people to vote for this prop, and therefore they wouldn't have to classify their drivers as employees, but in exchange they would give additional benefits such as 30 cents per mile in expenses, as well as health insurance if you work more than 15 hours per week. And that vote actually won with 60% in favor. But the interesting thing about this case was how hard all of these businesses pushed for this to not be the case, for these drivers to not be employees. And the reason for that is because these businesses are not profitable as is, let alone if they had to pay them significantly more and other things such as benefits and health insurance. Earlier this year, Uber lost its appeal in a Swiss federal court, which upheld an earlier decision that Uber drivers were employees and not independent contractors. As a result, Uber has actually been forced to suspend their operations in Switzerland. So now we turn to the stakeholder that most of us understand best, the customer. And the customer is also not getting a great deal here. Food costs are absolutely insane. And part of this is because the 30% fee that these delivery apps charge to restaurants causes restaurants to add a considerable premium to their food items over if you just went into the store. And that's really just the beginning. On top of that, there are delivery fees, there's service fees, there's small cart fees if your order isn't $15 or $20 or more. And I remember back just a few years ago when Uber Eats was relatively new, you would be able to get an order and have it delivered for $1 to $3 per order. Now, you might be lucky if you can pay $6. It's $6, $7, or $8 per order. But as I mentioned earlier, despite the fact that they're trying their best to pay their drivers as little as possible, as well at the same time charging restaurants and customers as much as possible and bringing in tens of billions of dollars in gross bookings in the process, none of these businesses are actually profitable. In 2021, Uber Eats gross bookings were $51.6 billion. And that brought in revenue for the company of $6.9 billion. And that was actually up 114% from the year before. But despite bringing in billions of dollars of revenue every single year, if we look at their profitability, and let's pick a very, very generous profit figure, EBITDA, which excludes many of the most important costs involved in this kind of business, they still lost $348 million. Let that sink in for a second. Uber Eats, they had $52 billion in gross bookings. That's about half as much as the sales at McDonald's restaurants worldwide. They have 38,000 stores worldwide. Half as much gross bookings, and they're still not making money. So if delivery apps are bad for drivers, restaurants, customers, even investors haven't done very well, who are these apps good for? Well, there actually is one stakeholder that's done quite well during this process. That's the executives. Named executives last year made $53 million. I mean, in 2019, the CEO made $42 million alone, and that's after Uber paid him $200 million to take the position in 2017 after the founder was forced out. The silver lining here is that most of this compensation is paid in stock, so it doesn't actually cost the business on an operational basis anything to pay out $40 million. It really just costs the investors who are losing ownership in the business over time, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later in this video. But before that, I want to talk about why it's been so difficult for these businesses to operate in this industry. And the key reason is because there's really nothing to differentiate between the different apps. There's nothing unique that protects any of the apps from competition. To play devil's advocate for 1 second, some investors have argued that the advantage that Uber Eats has over its competition is a network effect. A network effect essentially occurs when the value of a service to a customer increases by the use of the service by other customers. So in delivery apps case, you could argue that the more customers are on the app, the more likely a restaurant will want to list on the app, and therefore the more likely customers will use the app because there's more restaurants available. And it's kind of this flywheel or networking effect or positive feedback loop that makes the value of the service increase as more users use the service. And this is a competitive advantage because essentially if a business can get far enough ahead of competition through this flywheel, then they'll ultimately be able to charge higher prices for the higher value service that they have relative to the smaller networks in the same industry. And it also provides a significant barrier because if they can get far enough ahead, then the service will be so good that it'll be difficult for other services to compete on price. Now that all sounds really great in theory, but for a business like Uber Eats or these other delivery apps, it doesn't really work. And the reason why is because restaurants users, and drivers can all use multiple apps at the same time. These apps aren't mutually exclusive. Restaurants can list on DoorDash, Uber Eats, PostMates, Grubhub. They can list on everything. And drivers, even in the same shift, even in the same night, can be doing delivery for multiple different apps and for many different restaurants. And users can easily download multiple apps and shop and browse between all of them. If you compare this, for example, to something like YouTube's networking effect, YouTube is the only place that has the entire audience and all of the creators and all of the advertisers. It's this ecosystem that is so far ahead of any competition that there would be no benefit for me to post on a similar video sharing app, and there'd be no benefit for advertisers to look anywhere else. And most users will immediately go to YouTube if they're looking for a video. They're so far ahead that there is no competition, and that's completely different to the food delivery ecosystem. Check out this 2019 interview just after the business went public, where an executive at Uber Eats is trying to explain what their competitive advantage is, and even he has no idea what it is.
And as a customer, I'm kind of like, I don't get the differentiation.
One of them is reliability, the other one's speed. We're faster than some of the other providers out there. It's been a focus of Uber to be fast. Now, I understand that in a world where there's a lot of noise and restaurants are here or there, it can sort of feel similar at times.
But what do customers tend to, just the whole process of the things that when you quiz customers, which of the ones are the most important?
It depends. I mean, generally selection is the most important thing, generally speaking. But as more restaurants are on more platforms, service quality matters.
We're faster than some competitors out there. That's your advantage. You're faster than some. All I heard there was that the apps feel the same, but they're not. Uber's somehow better, even though they feel the same. Selection is the most important thing, but then he immediately acknowledges that other apps also can have wide selection. So then the next best or most important thing is service quality, which is kind of a strange thing to say when drivers are driving for all apps. So I don't exactly know what the difference in service is. But essentially, because there's very, very little differentiation between these apps, they end up, for the most part, competing on price. And at the same time, all of these businesses are trying to raise their prices. Even though they're trying to compete on price, they're also trying to raise their prices so that they can become profitable. And even worse for these businesses is it doesn't really scale very well. Unless these businesses increase their fees, then they're going to be scaling their revenue pretty much at a similar rate as how much they're paying their drivers, meaning their margins, for the most part, won't be improving. Of course, they could raise prices, and that's what they've been trying to do over time, but they're already tearing the eyes out of restaurants, customers, pretty much everybody involved. So it's hard to imagine there's that much more room to move on that dimension. There is a silver lining to this business, and that's that even though the economics don't work today, I think with technological advancement, the economics of this business will certainly be viable, and there certainly is a massive demand for this service. So I don't see this particular type of industry going away over time. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest variable cost that's kind of a roadblock for these kinds of businesses is the driver, is paying the driver. With technological advancement and drone delivery that could eventually be fully autonomous, then you can imagine that these businesses can eventually get to a place where their costs will be significantly lower as a percentage of revenue than they are today, and will likely be very, very profitable businesses. But this is a reality that is very, very far into the future, and I think in the meantime, we're just going to see these delivery apps continue to raise prices, and the service is ultimately going to become worse and worse. In fact, the only reason we have businesses like delivery apps today that are not profitable but have been around for a number of years now is because they've been able to access investor capital basically for free. With interest rates being at rock bottom for so long, equity investors essentially were willing to accept any return, even if it was basically zero. And that's why you've got companies that make no money but somehow still seem to find new investors who are willing to throw money into the economic fire. And I know that sounds negative, but I'm actually very, very grateful for people who are willing to invest blindly into businesses like Uber, because it means that I get to enjoy their services, even though they probably shouldn't exist.